Previously, we saw how Aristotle holds that essence is the main criterion of substantiality. Essence, in turn, was explained as what is definable. And what was said to be definable was the species of a genus. We ended with Aristotle's identification of the notion of species with that of form. Now, the leading theory of form in Aristotle's intellectual world would have been his teacher Plato's theory of the forms. This theory regarded the form as separate from, transcendent of, the concrete particular that was an instantiation of that form. We saw that Aristotle criticizes this theory as leading to incoherence. It implies that the particulars do not really possess the quality that they are the form of, and renders the quality itself unknowable, since we only have experience of the particular and not of the form, which is in itself transcendent. Instead, Aristotle proposes an alternative, namely that the form is imminent to the particular. So this is the key Aristotelian notion. Namely, that the form is imminent to the particular, imminent as opposed to transcendent as in Plato's theory. In other words, the form is nothing other than the species that the particular member of the species concretely embodies. The species that the particular member of the species concretely embodies. And thus it will turn out for Aristotle that the concrete particular is a composite of form and matter. That the particular is a form-matter composite. In chapter 7 of Zeta, Aristotle lays out how a concrete particular is produced. And in this way, he introduces his form-matter theory of substance, or hylomorphism, as it is usually known, or hylomorphism with an E, you see sometimes. But so the word for matter and the word for form, hylomorphism. Hylomorphic theory of substance that regards substance as a form-matter composite, which exists in the concrete particular. Now, the theory of production, as I said, is going to shed light for us on what Aristotle thinks of the composite nature of substance. All instances of production for him involve three things. First of all, they involve something that is produced. So we'll keep track of these here. Production involves something that is produced. The first thing's something that is produced. And two other elements, namely something by which it is produced, something by which that something that is produced is produced. So something that is produced and something by which it is produced. And then finally, something from which it is produced. Something from which it is produced. So we have in production something that is produced, something by which it is produced, and something from which it is produced. And we also have two types of production for Aristotle, either natural or artificial. Natural or artificial production. So in both cases, there's going to be, in the case of natural as well as artificial, there's going to be something that is produced, something by which it is produced, and something from which it is produced. So what are these things? How do we fill in this template? In the case of nature, the something that is produced is, he says, man or plant or something like that. So that's unsurprising. The something that is produced in the case of natural production, this first item is going to be man or plant or something like that. Second, the something by which it is produced is going to be a species form. So at this level, we have the form, which we saw identified already previously with the species. And then, unsurprisingly, you can probably guess what the third item is going to be. The something from which it is produced is going to be the matter, as he describes it, the matter or material of its nature. So that's production. Something is produced when it is produced by the form from the matter. That's his basic formula. In the case of makings or artificial production, the difference is that we have the involvement of skill or ability or thinking. He also has a secondary sense of artificial production, which is the what he calls the spontaneous production. But since that's not the paradigm case, we'll just leave that to one side. In the case of skill, something is produced by a form that is in the mind. For instance, actual health is produced from the idea of health. So if you look at Aristotle's example, which is on 190 through 191 in our text, this is 1032b in the Becker. He says, this is right at the bottom there, and continuing to the top of the next page. To produce health, that is, you must think as follows. Since this present item is health, of necessity, if health is to come about, this item must obtain, say, bodily consistency, and if the latter, then warmth. The sequence of thoughts always proceeds in this way until a position is reached in which their subject can act on their final claim. And immediately from here on, the process is termed a making, the making directed at health. So we have a picture here in which health is the product of production that is produced by a medical doctor who proceeds from an idea of health. So in this case, if what is going to be produced is health, the idea in the mind of the medical doctor corresponds to the form of health. The Greek word could also be translated as idea, and it's more natural for us in this context, I think, to translate it as idea. We say that the idea of health in the mind of the doctor, the idea of what health involves, the understanding of health, is what is used to produce health when health is put into some kind of material. Here it's the bodily consistency that he describes, bodily warmth, that is played with, so to speak, by the medical doctor in order to produce the form of health in a concrete particular, namely a particular person's body. So the maker here realizes or makes into a thing the idea in his mind. So there's this close connection between idea and form, especially when we're dealing with the artificial, got a little smudged there, the artificial type of production. There's a real sense in which the maker puts the idea form in his or her mind into the concrete form of the product. Although Aristotle's example here is medicine, this point might be made more clearly actually in his second example of architecture. Here, I think it's clearer how the architect realizes the idea form in his mind in using it as a template for the concrete form of a, and I don't mean here concrete in the sense of material, but specific, particular form of a stone building. The architect is using that form, and it's out of the material of the stone that the production is realized. So matter is always involved in every case of making just as much as it is in every case of natural production. There must be, Aristotle says, always something that antecedently exists. Always something that antecedently exists. So if you look on page 191, the last paragraph there, he says, so bodily warmth is either an element in health or attended by something that is an element in health, either directly or through various stages. And the last stage of this that produces the element is itself in this way an element in health, or of a building, for example, bricks, or of other cases. There cannot then, as they say, be production unless something antecedently exists. So clearly some element must of necessity obtain. After all, the matter is an element. It is internal to the thing and becomes what the thing is. It is internal to the thing and becomes what the thing is. Okay, so there's the account of production, and we see how this serves as an explanation for how concrete substantial particulars for Aristotle have this hylomorphic structure. It's a matter of putting a form into some material, and out of that we get the thing that is produced. And so production is always going to have this hylomorphic structure involving a form and a matter. Production is always going to have both the form and the matter as part of it. That is how he understands production, whether you're talking about natural things being produced or artificial things. All right. So on to Zeta 8. So far, it's clear that for Aristotle, production is a process of composition, resulting in a composite or compound of form and matter. Production is the result of putting form into matter, either by a natural process or by an artificial one. And in chapter 8, Aristotle makes the observation that his view of production implies that the form itself cannot be produced. The form itself cannot be produced. So if we look on 194 here, this is 1033b. Towards the bottom, he says, what all this shows is that, 1, the form, shape, and object of perception, call it what you will, is not produced. The form is not produced. 2, there is no production of it. And 3, neither does the what it was to be that thing. Neither does the what it was to be that thing. It is this that is realized in something else by dint of skill, nature, or ability. So the point here, I think, is that the matter isn't what produces the form either. It's not, there's no production of it in the sense of it doesn't come from some other form or a producer or efficient cause, and neither does it come from a material cause. So there's no formal cause, nor is there a material cause of a form. However, that there is a bronze sphere, for example, a bronze sphere is an output of production. The production is from bronze and sphere. The form is imported into this stuff, and the result is a bronze sphere. But then, quite generally, if to be in sphere form is itself the output of the production, then this will be a case of something being produced from something. The rule cannot here be suspended that all outputs of production can be split up with this component and that component, and I am saying that the one is matter and the other form. But this would mean that if we take to be a sphere to be a figure at all points equally remote from to its midpoint, so two separate things, that if we take the sphere, that he's imagining something like this. So suppose you take a case like this. You say a sphere has a form and a matter, and you say, well, the form is something like, a figure at all points equally remote from its midpoint. That is, if you divide up the form of a sphere into itself a form-matter composite. So he's imagining that someone is suggesting that we explain how the form is produced by saying that, well, it's produced just like everything else is produced, namely by forming a particular material. And the form and the matter are going to be these two parts, which obviously are abstract now in this sense compared to the broad sphere. But he says there's a problem here, but that one of these must be the component in which the other is produced and the other component which is produced in the other. And the two together will be the output of production on a parallel with the way the broad sphere is such an output. But this only goes to show still more clearly that the component that is spoken of as form or substance is not produced, whereas the composite entity that is named after it is an output of production, and thus that matter is present that in every output of production that such things are both a this and a that. So what he's getting at here is that the form in this case has to still be regarded as not produced. So you can say that the form of sphere is produced in the way everything else is by forming a material, and you call these two parts of sphericality the form and the matter of the thing. He's just using this as a hypothetical. But even still, in this case, we still have something that's not produced. All right, we can say that the sphere is produced when this material is formed, but the form is still going to be unproduced. If production just is the introduction of form into matter, then to produce a form would have to be a case of introducing a form into some matter in order to produce a form. But in that case, we would once again have to account for this new form that was introduced into some matter. Here, the figure at all points equidistant. We still have to account for this new form that we've now conjured up in order to produce an account of where it came from as a form, in order to explain how it was produced as a form. And again, we can't, if we're going to appeal to the same procedure of forming matter, it's pretty clear that this is going to lead us to an infinite regress, right? So we can divide this thing into some kind of form and matter if we want to really slice it thinly. But we're still going to have a form here that hasn't been accounted for. We've got to go back again and do the same procedure again. See, so this is going to be the inevitable difficulty that we run into. So this leads to this important conclusion that forms have to be regarded as uncreated things. Forms are uncreated things. So this leads us to a first discussion question. Is Aristotle right that we have to regard forms as uncreated things? Is Aristotle right that we have to regard forms as uncreated things? Does this imply that they are also things that it is impossible to destroy? Does this imply that they're also things that it is impossible to destroy? Because it seems like if production is a matter of bringing form and matter together, then it would seem that destruction would have to be a matter of decomposition, taking form and matter apart. So it would seem like if the form wasn't created, neither could it be destroyed. It would still exist after decomposition. But is that the case? Does that have to be the case? Do we have to imagine that being the case? So is Aristotle right? We have to regard forms as uncreated things. Does this imply that forms also cannot be destroyed? And is his view compatible with modern science? Is his view compatible with modern science? And maybe not so much compatible, but you might think in a weaker sense, is it something that is congenial to modern science? Is it sort of, does it dovetail with modern science, or is it in tension with it? Friction. What's the relation? Okay, what about matter? Doesn't it also have to be regarded as something uncreated? Something that is not produced, that just is? We've already seen that Aristotle seems to think that's not the case. Rather, in his view, we've already seen this argued in Zeta 3. Matter has this kind of insubstantiality in itself. Prime matter seems to lack the requisite thisness and separability to be substance. It is, as we observed in a previous video, in itself very akin to nothing, or perfect indeterminacy. It's so indeterminate as to be almost like nothing. So now we're prepared to add an interesting specification to this theory, that Matter is always a material, it seems, that has a specific species form. There's no matter as such, except as an abstract conceptual possibility. Whenever we talk about matter or material, it's always going to be the stony material of a granite statue, or the woody material of a tree, or the vegetable material of a tomato, or the fleshly material of a mammal. And it's interesting to think in Aristotle's case whether, he has an account, or he could think of substance as just a heap of something like granite or marble or something like that. Because his paradigm seems to be the kind of thing that has an internal unity characteristic of an organism. And so just a heap of stuff, a truckload of sand, doesn't seem like it would count as a substance for Aristotle per se, although it is still material. But again, even here, it's a material that's relative to a particular species, a particular type or kind of material. In this case, quartz or whatever it is. So this leads to a second discussion question very quickly. Is this Aristotelian view of matter, that matter is always material that is specific to a definite species form, that there's no matter as such except as an abstract conceptual possibility, is this Aristotelian view of matter that I just outlined, is it rendered obsolete by modern physical science? Or is there a way in which it remains a viable metaphysical conception of the fundamental nature of matter? So is this view that there is no sort of uniform matter, that there's always matter that's under some species of matter or other? Is that rendered obsolete by modern science? Or is there a way in which it remains a viable metaphysical conception of the fundamental nature of matter? Okay, so the second question is about this Aristotelian view of matter as being apparently relative to a species in this way, where prime matter is relegated to a kind of limbo of indeterminacy and nothingness. Now, at the end of Zeta 8, Aristotle contrasts his theory of production with Plato's. And once again, we see him arguing that the idea of an imminent form is superior to that of a transcendent external form. One standard objection to Platonism, probably the most common objection to Platonism, which Aristotle seems to apply here, is what became known as Occam's razor. Many of you have probably heard of this by a medieval scholastic philosopher named William of Occam. Occam's razor. And this principle says that one should not multiply entities beyond what is strictly necessary in one's metaphysics. One should not multiply entities beyond what is strictly necessary. And not just in metaphysics, but in physics or in science in general. One should not multiply entities beyond what is strictly necessary. And so Occam's razor is a problem for Plato if it's a valid principle, because Plato posits forms as separate substances in themselves, apart from the concrete particulars that common belief tells us are substances in their own right. And from Aristotle's perspective, this metaphysical posit is unnecessary, and it can and should be eliminated from our philosophy. So he makes this point around 195. He says, there is no reason at all for the forms to be substances in themselves. There's no reason at all for the forms to be substances in themselves. That's still on 1033b, two-thirds down on page 195. There's no reason at all for the forms to be substances in themselves. We don't need, for example, to say the form horse produced a particular horse, some kind of transcendent entity. We already have accounted for its production by citing the mare, that is M-A-R-E, namely its mother, that produced it. The mare instilled by a natural process the species form of horse into the colt or the filly. We would now say, the DNA, but of course Aristotle didn't have that concept. So we can just account for the production of concrete particulars in terms of other concrete particulars that have the same imminent species form. This explains, of course, why, from horses you get other horses, and from cows you get other cows, and so forth. because they have the same species form that is transferred from the parent to the offspring. Okay. So skipping ahead here to Zeta 10, we've repeatedly noticed that essence is the primary substance for Aristotle, and that the notion of essence is explained by him in terms of what is definable. In other words, the essence of a thing is what it's spelled out in its definition. We've also seen that not just anything and everything is definable for Aristotle. Real definitions properly belong to simple things that are non-composites and have only essential properties. Real definitions properly belong to simple things that are non-composites and have only essential properties. So all of that is what we covered previously. And we saw that this was the line of thinking that led Aristotle to conclude that species form is the essence. Only the species has all and only essential properties. Now, we've already discussed a bit the controversial character of Aristotle's theory of definition. He supposes that true definitions are metaphysically linked to species, and that there's a kind of metaphysical knowledge to be had from correctly defining a thing. The question in this chapter, Zeta 10, and the following two chapters is the question of the nature of definition. What is the nature of definition? And given the centrality of the concept of definition, the concept of a true or real definition in Aristotle's metaphysics, we should expect him to have something to say, certainly in defense of this concept. The two issues he considers are separate, but they're related issues. One is, which parts of a thing must be a thing defined, which parts of a thing defined must be included in the definition. Which parts of a thing defined must be included in the definition? So that's the first sort of subset of this question of the nature of definition and the way he addresses it. And second is the issue of the relation between the whole and the parts of things. What's the relation between the whole and the parts of things? And this is going to be a real can of worms, which we're not going to completely explore here. It opens a whole range of metaphysical issues about the relationship between wholes and parts. But we're going to focus here just on how his theory of the relation of wholes and parts and different relationships that obtain between wholes and parts figures into his understanding of what the nature of a definition is. Okay. So these issues are going to be mutually interdependent for Aristotle. Now, Aristotle starts with two examples. First, he notes that we define a circle without reference to its parts. We define a circle without reference to its parts. Whereas we define a syllable in reference to its parts. So sometimes it seems the definition refers to the parts, and other times the definition doesn't refer to the parts. What accounts for this difference? First, maybe just to fill in a little bit what he's thinking of in case there's any unclarity here. So, if you define a circle as a figure that's bounded by having all of its points equidistant from a center, every segment of the circle is not going to figure into that definition. We've just talked about points and their distance from the center. We haven't talked about the segments, which are always going to be the parts of a circle. Of course, you might think of the points as the parts of the circle, but actually the points is just a kind of abstraction since it has no extension. And so it's really these segments are always going to have multiple points in them, no matter how small you draw it. So it seems to be the idea here. Whereas a syllable is defined as a combination of a vowel sound and various consonants. And so it's going to have this reference to the parts that make it up, namely these letters, vowels and consonants. So that's the difference he has in mind. And then he wants to say, well, what accounts for the difference? Why is it important to mention the parts in the definition of a syllable, but it's not necessary to mention the parts, the segments, in the definition of a circle? And the answer has to do with the relation between the whole and the parts of things. Aristotle explains that there are things in which the whole is prior to the parts, and other cases in which the parts are prior to the whole. So, you have cases in which cases in which whole is prior to parts, and cases in which parts are prior to whole. So this idea of priority and the corresponding term posteriority, cases in which the whole is prior to the parts and cases in which the, what did I put here? Parts are prior to the whole. I'm getting a reflection, so I can't see so well at the time of day. So we have prior parts, we might say, and posterior parts. Be technical terms of art we could use here. When the parts are prior to the whole, we have prior parts. When the whole is prior to the parts, the parts are posterior. And this is clearest perhaps in the case in which we're talking about an animal, and the parts of an organism like an animal. A man is not merely an aggregate or collection of parts, like a pile of flesh. A finger, for example, gets its account as a part of something that is prior to it. What is a finger? It's a part of a hand. What is a hand? It's a part of a human body that performs such and such function. And Aristotle adds to this, this is on page 201, he says that the wholes are prior in respect of mutual independence and being. So there are two conditions here in the case of posterior parts. It's from these wholes that the accounts of these parts are derived. So I get my account of finger from this larger account of what it is to be a human being. And second, the wholes are prior in respect of mutual independence of being. That is, I could cut off a finger, then I lose my finger, but I still exist independently of that finger that I just lost. But the finger does no longer exist, at least not as a finger. Maybe now it's it's a piece of meat or something like that, but it's no longer a finger in the fullest sense. Of course, you might still say, "Oh, look at that finger," but we're thinking of it in a derivative or secondary sense. It's lost some of its fingerness insofar as now it's just a piece of rotting meat. Okay. So in sum, the relation of man and finger is a relation in which the whole is prior to the parts. And a circle is like this. He wants to say its parts, its segments, are accounted for just by drawing limitations on the whole. We always start, in the case of something like a circle, with a whole. And then if you want to say this segment, think about geometry class or whatever, we say, let's talk about this segment, and we start talking about the properties of it and so on. What would happen if you drew a tangent and all this. But we were drawing limitations in the whole, which is prior to it. Whereas in the case of syllables, the parts, the vowels and consonants, are prior in their account, or to the account rather, of the whole. The letters are individual independent elements. Think about the elementary school classroom. You have the alphabet up there, right? On the wall somewhere. These are independent elements that are prior to the construction of syllables. So there's that difference. In the case of syllables, we have parts that are prior to the whole. Use our little example here. Remember from elementary school, You've got big A, small a, big B, small b, and so on. All the, right? These are prior to the whole, but in the case of a circle, where the whole is prior to the parts that we're going to mark out. Now, Aristotle goes on to link this notion of the priority or posteriority of parts to wholes with his hylomorphic theory of substance. So on page 202, we have this passage. He says, second paragraph, and now we have our explanation of the fact that A, the account of the circle does not comprise that of the segments, while B, the account of the syllable does comprise that of the letters. It is because the letters are parts of the account of the form and do not constitute matter, while the manner in which the segments are parts is that of the matter on which the form is superimposed. Skipping down a bit here. But there is also a way in which not even all letters of the syllable are comprised in the account. These waxen inscriptions that we read, these spoken letters that we hear, for instance, are not so comprised. These letters, though letters, are already to be reckoned as parts of the syllable, as perceptible matter. So there's a perceptible matter in the sounds or in the visual impressions that the letters register on our sensory apparatus. Let us go further. A line is indeed destroyed by being divided into halves. A man is indeed destroyed by being dissipated into bones, sinews, and morsels of flesh. But this does not entail that those entities are composed of those items in such a way that they are parts of their substance. The fact is that they are material, being parts of the composite whole, but never of the form and the bearer of the account. So what Aristotle wants to say here is that the definition is the account of the form. And this, of course, is very consistent with what he says about definition belonging to the species form. So when the parts of a whole are parts of the form, they must be included in the definition. When the parts of a whole are parts of the form, they must be included in definition. By contrast, when the parts belong to the matter, they must not be included in the definition. And in a man or a circle, the parts belong to the matter, he wants to say. In the letters, they're also parts, but they belong to the matter. That's the sensible, perceptible sound or the visual impression that it makes. So I'll say that again. The definition is an account of the form. So when the parts of the whole are parts of the form, they must be included in the definition. By contrast, when the parts belong to the matter, they must not be included in the definition. In a man or a circle, the parts belong to the matter. However, in a syllable, they belong to the form. We might ask how he knows this. What's the epistemological basis of this? And based on the passage I just read, it seems actually to have mostly to do with epistemological considerations. So, if it is discerned by the intellect and the conceptual understanding, it belongs to the form. And these are the prior parts of things. If it's discerned by immediate sensory perception or by intuition, it belongs to the matter. And these are the posterior parts of things. So form goes with intellect, it seems, or the intelligible. Whereas the matter goes with the sensible or perceptible. And this is an important distinction in Plato, where the sensible or perceptible is relegated to a sort of lower degree of reality from the intellect. Okay. Now, it's an important aspect of Aristotle's theory that the form of an organism, which, as we've seen, is prior to its parts, is associated with the soul, or the animating principle of the body. He makes this clear on 203. At the bottom there, bottom paragraph, he says, in the case of animals, it is the soul, the substance of the living thing, that is the substance, as specified in this account, the form and the what it was to be, that thing for a body of this kind. And he goes on to say that the soul and its parts will be prior. So the soul is associated with the form in animals. And the soul here, in this sense, just means the or living things, not just in animals. So this is, oops. What I'm thinking of is the idea of the animating principle would be another word for what Aristotle means by the soul here. The soul is the animating principle, so that's what I was thinking of animals more than plants. But it applies to any living thing. It's going to have this animating principle in it, and that's its soul, which also goes by the name of the substantial form of a living thing. So we can say the substantial form of a living thing is its soul. Now, this identification of the soul with the substantial form has an important apparent consequence. We've seen that on Aristotle's account of production, a form can be neither created nor destroyed. So if a soul is a substantial form, it would seem that it could neither be created nor destroyed, or arguably not destroyed. So there's a kind of possibility here within this metaphysics to give an account of the immortality of the soul, potentially. There's not an argument in it insofar as the soul is something that's uncreated, but we could try to develop an argument perhaps on that ground. Okay, but he doesn't do that here. So turning to chapter 11, in this chapter, Aristotle begins by inquiring anew into a question that you might have thought he already answered, namely, what sort of parts are the form and what sort are the compound? He's evidently concerned with two apparent ways in which a form can be imposed on a matter. First, there are cases in which there's a clear separability of the form and the matter. So, for example, take a circle as a form. This is a form that can be imposed on a variety of different species of material like bronze, wood, stone, and so on. It really does seem to be a compound in a clear sense. Although a circle always has to be instantiated into something, it can be instantiated into various types of material. Second, there are cases like man in which it seems that there is an inseparable material, flesh, blood, bones, sinews, etc., that is always being imposed upon, that it is always being imposed upon. The form man or human being is always going to be imposed upon the same type of material. We never see stone men or wood men, except maybe in The Wizard of Oz or something like that. So it's this second type of case, the case where there seems to be an inseparability of matter and form, that raises a potential puzzle or problem for Aristotle's account. Given that they always go together with the form man, isn't it more correct to say that flesh, blood, bones, and sinews are part of the form? Now, Aristotle's defense is to say that, well, matter is in fact inseparable from form in some cases. There's still an important distinction to be made between the form and the matter. In the case of these things that involve animals and plants with an inseparable kind of matter, the definition must include the fact that an animal or plant is a perceptible object that is perceptible by the senses. And this means that the purely formal account cannot refer simply to the parts, but it has to refer to a certain state or characteristic activity of the parts as well. So we see here in 208 in the second paragraph, this is, where are we at now? 1036b. He says, one strays from the purpose of definition if one confines oneself to a formal account and simply discards the material element in these sorts of cases of inseparability. Some things, it would seem, just are a this in a that, or such and such items in such and such a state. Skipping down a bit, he says, the animal is a sort of perceptible object, and there can be no defining of these which prescinds from processes, and thus none that prescinds from the parts being in the appropriate condition. That is to say, when you're defining an animal, you're defining not just a collection of parts, but you're defining things that work in a certain way according to certain processes. There's an irreducible process element to the metaphysical or ontological nature or constitution or form of these types of things that have this kind of inseparability of form and content. So you still have to refer to the perceptible. As witness the fact that it is not the hand in absolutely any state you please that is part of the man, but the hand with the capacity to discharge its function, namely the hand that is alive. The lifeless hand, on the other hand, is not a part of the man. And so, I mean, the idea here seems to be then that you need to have this kind of perceptual reference, an example to something that can only be clarified through our perception of it. And that implies there's got to be this material element as well as the purely formal element. Okay. In addition to this, there's also the problem that the generic formal account of, for example, man, doesn't take into account the obvious fact that there are really distinct particular men at the level of perception. So how do we account for man without allowing for the possibility of particular men and individual souls? And how can we have two or more particular men without their having different matters? That's another additional reason to suppose we need this idea of a material supplement to the form as well. So he answers this objection that says that the form and matter are really the same thing. No, we have to suppose that there's this excess, you might say, of material beyond our purely formal definition, because the formal definition itself includes references to these perceptible elements. Finally, in chapter 12, we see Aristotle addressing the question of the relationship between the definition and the unity of the substance. And Aristotle is clear that a definition had better be a unity because we know that substance has to have unity by its very nature. As he says on 2:12, the elements of a definition had better constitute a unity. After all, a definition is a unitary sort of account. And since it is an account of substance, it must be an account of a single thing, given that, as we have stressed, substance picks out something that is a unity and has thisness. So, how can we get a unity out of a definition? Or what must a definition be if it's the definition of a thing that has to be a unity? And here we get Aristotle's account of definition by division. So part of the answer to the question of the nature of definition is that it has to be definition by division. Definition by division. Division, namely, of a genus into its specific differences or differentia. So you got the genus, the generic account, and then the specific difference. So scientifically, we can divide every genus into a species and differentia, and a definition for Aristotle is ultimately going to be achieved when we reach the last of the differentia of a genus. When we've reached the last differentium, the final specific difference, we've reached the definition and its substance. So he gives an elaborate example of this. I won't read that here because we're getting near the end of our time, or actually we're over. But But the idea here seems to be that there's a unity because we're really just talking about two parts that have some kind of identity. The genus and the specific differences really aren't the same thing. Rather, what we're dealing with here is a kind of subset, so that the genus is still present in some way in the differentia. Although, even though evidently he takes this to be a solution to the problem of how a definition can be a unity, perhaps he doesn't really spell it out as clearly as we might like. So this leads us to our fourth and concluding discussion question. How can definition by division into genus and species account for the unity of a definition and therefore the unity of a substance? How can definition by division into genus and species account for the unity of a definition and therefore the unity of a substance?